Okay.
All right, go ahead.
So I actually want to, before I introduce Dr. Gowda, I would like to sort of mention what it does, what it means to be recognized by the CDC. And it's not like we have a placard, but what it does mean is that at the South Asian Heart Center, we have been able to help our participants meet the criteria of the diabetes prevention program with the main criteria that of weight loss. So it's very difficult to demonstrate any program that can lead to and sustain that weight loss. And the South Asian Heart Center has been able to accomplish that. Now, having said that, I think that this is actually, today's topic is actually very, very important. When we started 16 years ago, we created MEDS, which was our lifestyle coaching program. And that MEDS stood for M for meditation, E for exercise, D for diet, and S for sleep. Now, we were the only one at that time that was actually including sleep in an all-around lifestyle routine for the prevention of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Most recently, the American Heart Association has updated their 7th to their 8th lifestyle habits, including sleep as a very important one of the 8 suggestions for good living. Having said that, and having talked about the benefits of sleep and what happens when there's insufficient sleep, we have not been able to provide adequate technology and adequate coaching or information to really help people who have sleep disorders achieve that goal. There are medications, and medications actually, they themselves, some of those medications are associated with decreased longevity, when in fact we want to enhance longevity. So today, we're actually going to get Dr. Gowda tell us how do we go about achieving adequate rest. And she's actually a psychologist and the founder of ThinkSleep.org. And we have not presented anyone here before who actually has worked for the FBI or Special Operations Unit and things of that sort. So I think it's going to be a fantastic talk. We will not uncover her cover, being a member of the CIA or anything like that. But I don't think that that I can add anything more that the impression that you will get when she's done with her talk. So please go ahead, Dr. Gowda.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen so we can get started. All right. So it's a pleasure to speak about sleep with all of you this evening. My goal today is really to provide you with as much information, general information about sleep as I can, and some tips and strategies to achieve healthy sleep along the way. And I'm happy to answer questions as we go through the information. But to make it a little bit fun, I also wanted to start off by asking a few true-false questions, and, feel free to answer in the chat. We'll kind of get a sense on what people think, but we'll revisit these questions later on to see, how much we've learned and if your idea of sleep changes as we go through. So a few true-false questions for you to get started. Melatonin is a sedative that can help treat insomnia if taken correctly. So what are your thoughts? Do you feel like this statement is true or false?
Okay. No. True.
So we're getting a lot in the chat, it looks like. I heard a couple trues and I see quite a few falses and a few trues in the chat. Okay, so keep this in mind. I'm going to keep on going, and then we'll revisit these a little bit later. So another true false, sleeping in on the weekends is good as long as my weekly average is about 7 to 8 hours a night.
Yes.
Okay, again, we're getting some mixed responses, which is great because that means that we're going to be learning one way or the other. Okay, you cannot train your body to get by on less sleep. What do we think about this question? This statement, is it true or false?
True.
All right. I'm just waiting for, when as people respond, we'll wait to get to the next one. Okay. No amount of caffeine is healthy and good for sleep. Okay. All prescription sleep aids change your natural sleep architecture. Okay, and lastly, well, I guess that was our last one. So thank you for answering. We will certainly discuss, aspects of all of these questions and sort of revisit to see if anybody's changed their opinion as we go through. I thought I'd start by going over just some basic sleep science and sleep information, mostly because I think when we talk about sleep, there's a lot of misinformation out there, especially in the media. When you're reading about ways to improve sleep, we tend to read things that are kind of contradictory. So we're not really sure. There are a lot of myths out there of, well, what is healthy adult sleep? How do we really achieve it? What should we do? So I just want to start by saying how complex sleep is. Oftentimes we really push sleep as a behavior that we push to the side. We don't give it the attention that it deserves because it's something that we feel is so passive. It kind of, for some of us, it comes naturally every evening or night. And so we don't pay much attention to it. But it's certainly a very complex process. I by no means want to get into, the details and the neurochemistry of sleep, but I show these images to highlight how complex sleep is, how many brain regions are truly involved, how many neurotransmitters and hormones that you hear about are involved. And it's not just one or two things that we strive for. When you read about medications and supplements, you probably see a lot of different ingredients. And so I just like to highlight that we do have sort of a wake promoting center and a sleep promoting center in our brain. And, sleep sort of originates down here in the brainstem. But, you'll have these sort of slides to reference over time. So you can kind of see all of the different regions, as well as neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, hormones that are involved. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what we call sleep architecture. So sleep architecture is essentially the different stages of sleep that we go through. And, I like to describe it as sort of three states that we can be in. We can be awake and we can be asleep. And within sleep, we can be in either rapid eye movement sleep or non-rapid eye movement. So REM, REM, you've probably heard of these stages often. Non-REM has 3 stages, 1, 2, and 3. Previously we used to divide non-REM into 4 stages. So if you ever hear stage 4, we've now sort of clumped 3 and 4 into one stage. So if you look at the image on the right, you'll see that this is what your brain activity relatively looks like when you're in each stage. So I'm going to, simplify it just for the sake of today's talk. And of course, if you have questions in more depth, we can certainly discuss it. But for simplicity's sake, our brain activity is very active when we're awake. And so the way that I kind of describe brain activity when you're awake, you can kind of see how rigid these lines are, how active we are when we're awake. We're processing a lot of information. And then stage 1 is what I like to describe as this sort of transition into sleep stage. We typically don't spend a lot of time in stage 1, 5% or so for the average adult is what we spend. This stage is the best way I like to describe it. If you're ever sitting on the couch or your sofa in the evenings before bed, you're probably watching TV, maybe with family, friends, and you notice that someone's eyes close. You might even hear them breathing heavily or lightly snoring. But if you say their name, they would kind of jerk awake and say, I wasn't sleeping, I was awake. Or perhaps you've done that yourself to someone else. That's typically waking up from stage 1. And that's because we actually have a little bit of sensory awareness during that stage. We can kind of smell things. We are still sort of having some thought processes. We can slightly hear things, but we're in a light stage of sleep. So 80% of people who are woken up from this stage truly believe that they were awake. Then we have stage 2. This is a much deeper than stage 1 stage. You definitely know that you have been asleep if you're woken up from stage 2. Approximately 50% of the night is spent here. So this is the majority of where we spend a course of the night. And this stage is associated with a number of processes, but we often recognize stage 2 to be where a lot of cognitive processing is happening. So memory consolidation, sort of processing information from the day to really allow it to go from sort of short-term into long-term memory. And then you can see sort of in the middle, some ragged lines that kind of, increase in amplitude. And that's what we call sort of sleep spindles or K complexes. And that is very much associated with learning and memory consolidation and recovery. Stage 3 is what we call deep sleep. Now, I think that when we say, deep sleep, a lot of us use that term or that phrase to identify sleep where they really felt like they were sleeping. Like when they woke up from that sleep, they felt like it was restorative and they really felt as though they were awake and it was restful. And that can actually happen from a number of different stages. You can feel that way from different stages. But the official sort of term deep sleep is referring to this one stage of sleep, stage 3. And we call it deep sleep because our brain activity is at its slowest that it will be in sleep. So you can kind of see that our brain activity gets really slow, sort of synchronous. You can see these waves are really further apart, and that's what we call delta waves. We only spend about 20% of the night in deep sleep, and that's it. So common questions I always get asked, by patients or people really interested in sleep is, well, how do I get more deep sleep? And I always remind people that, deep sleep is not better sleep. We want to get the breakdown that is healthy for adults, which is what I'm describing here, about 20%, give or take 5% of stage 3 sleep. And then we want to make sure that we have other percentages of other stages. Deep sleep is often associated with physical recovery. So, muscle repair, tissue damage, sort of on a cellular level, our body is getting recovered when we're in deep sleep. And then lastly, we have REM sleep. REM sleep is, if I were to just summarize it in 2 words, I would say mental health. REM sleep is where we have a lot of emotion regulation. So, If you notice when you're not getting the sleep that you need, you might notice that you're more irritable, you might lash out, you might not have the patience that you would have had you had a great night of sleep. And that's because our body maybe and our brain did not get the ability to really recover and regulate our emotions. And so, mild symptoms of depression, anxiety, low mood, all are getting recovered when we get the REM sleep that we need. And REM sleep is also called dream sleep. A lot of people refer to it as dream sleep because we are vividly dreaming. So some of those dreams that you might wake up from where you feel like you were there, it was very colorful, you can remember it, it felt like it was real life. It's very likely that you're waking up from REM sleep. You spend about 25% of the night, give or take, in that stage. I also want to highlight how we cycle across the course of the night, because I think that we have this misunderstanding that we cycle sort of in 90-minute cycles, and we kind of cycle the exact same way every cycle. But realistically, the way that you would read this is a hypnogram is what we call this image. And if you yourself has ever had an overnight sleep study, you've probably seen a hypnogram for yourself, or perhaps if you wear any sleep technologies, you might have an image of this nightly. But here on the x-axis, you'll see that the different stages are listed, and they will always be listed in this order, from awake to REM 1, 2, and 3. And that is by no means listed that way in order of importance, in order of how we cycle. It's really listed that way because that is how our brain activity slows. So most active to the slowest brain activity, which is how we sort of stay consistent here. And then this is a typical, these are the hours of sleep. So this is a healthy adult who, for this example, is getting a little less than 8 hours of sleep. So this just shows how they've cycled across the course of 8 hours. And what I want sort of you to take away from this is that the deep sleep that we get, that 20% of that stage 3, happens right up front. So the 20% of deep sleep happens within those first few hours, and then you're essentially done with the deep sleep. You don't return to deep sleep for the remainder of the night. And this is a healthy way that we cycle. So oftentimes people always ask me, Dr. Gowda, I always get awakenings after a few hours of sleep, and I'm sort of wide awake and I struggle to fall back to sleep. How come I feel more rested then than if I were to wake up a few hours later? And there could be a number of reasons for that, but a very likely explanation is that your body has just gotten the deep sleep that it needs, and then it's woken up, because we have natural awakenings. The average adult has many awakenings each night, completely healthy, completely normal. But typically we fall back to sleep pretty quickly. So waking up is not concerning. If you have trouble falling back to sleep relatively quickly, that's something that we'll definitely discuss as a condition that can be improved. But I don't want anyone to think that if they're sleeping well, they're going to fall asleep very quickly, they're going to stay in deep sleep throughout the night, and then they're going to wake up and feel fantastic. And that's truly, unfortunately, not how a healthy adult is naturally going to cycle through the night. So deep sleep happens up front, and then you'll see and you'll notice that our REM periods, they slowly increase, and they happen more and they happen longer as we go about the night. So a lot more of that dreaming and emotion regulation happens in the later half of the night. And I highlight this because oftentimes we tend to do math, basic math, when we're trying to get sleep at night. We think, okay, well, I know I should get closer to 8 hours, which is what my body needs, but I'm going to get 4 hours. I'm going to only be able to get 4 hours tonight. So at least I'm getting 50% of the sleep that I need. And you might be getting 50% of the total sleep that you need. But what's important to note is that you may be getting 90% of the deep sleep that you need, but maybe only 10 to 20% of the REM sleep that you need. So it's really important that we don't shortchange our sleep because each of these stages are incredibly important. Briefly, I'll mention how sleep changes across the lifespan. you know, so much of our body changes as we get older. Sleep is no different. I wish that sleep could stay the same as when we were children, but unfortunately that's not the case. So here you can see 3 hypnograms. One is for more of a typical child in adolescence, perhaps. And then this is sort of a younger adult and then an older adult down at the bottom. So children get a lot more of the deep sleep. So if you have children or grandchildren, or if you've been around children and they fall asleep somewhere that's not their own bed and you have to carry them to bed, you'll notice how heavily they're sleeping and how they feel kind of like dead weight. And that's because they get a lot more deep sleep, especially right up front. So we get less deep sleep as we get older. Significantly less as we sort of hit our 60s and older. And our sleep does fragment a lot more in older adulthood. So as you can see, we have a lot more awakenings throughout the night, and our sleep is sort of fragmented and expanded. And that's for a number of reasons. Our body requires less deep sleep. One of the theories is that deep sleep is when the growth hormone is released, which is why children get a lot more of that deep sleep, and it slowly declines as we get older. This is another way that you can look at staging across the lifespan. So again, you'll have these slides to reference, so I'll sort of skim through this one quickly. But from ages 5 to 85 years old here at the bottom, you know, what I'd like for you to notice is we've got stage 1 at the bottom here, stage 2, that 50% of the night, which is why it's so large here, stage 2. SWS is our deep sleep. It stands for slow wave sleep, which is that stage 3. And then we've got REM sleep. So if you ignore the top 2 for a moment, that's wakefulness. You'll notice that from newborn all the way through older adulthood, we have a decline in the total amount of sleep that we get, and we have a significant decline in the total amount of slow wave sleep that we get. Okay, so let's talk about sleep deprivation now. Sleep deprivation, you know, I don't need to spend time talking about how important sleep is. I think we all recognize, especially if we're attending this talk today, that sleep is incredibly important. It's important for not only our, you know, functioning, like our cognitive abilities, our attention, our memory during the day, but also things that we don't notice on a day-to-day basis, like every organ system in our body is getting some sort of recovery and rest when we're sleeping. So sleep deprivation, you know, there are different forms. You can have total sleep deprivation, which would, an example of that would be someone who just stayed awake the entire night, didn't sleep at all. Most of us, I would say, who are sleep deprived have what we call chronic partial sleep deprivation, which is where they're getting less than what they need consistently over time. And there are many reasons for why someone might be sleep deprived. So, you know, I always say and joke that as humans, we are the only species that voluntarily deprives ourselves of sleep, meaning that there are some of us who we are sleepy. We could go to bed and go to sleep. Nothing's getting in the way, but perhaps we're procrastinating. We're finishing doing the dishes. We're finishing doing any task we could possibly do, maybe even watching TV or Netflix and pushing off sleep. So of course we can do that voluntarily, but oftentimes we have such busy lifestyles and schedules that our personal social obligations or our work hours don't allow us to get the quality sleep or the quantity sleep that we need. And examples of, you know, work conditions would be if you're working multiple jobs across the clock, if you're working nights or shift work, so your work schedule or hours are sort of constantly changing. And then there are a whole host of medical conditions that sort of eat at the sleep that we do get. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But certainly if you're experiencing chronic pain, that can interfere with your quality and quantity of sleep at night. Things like untreated sleep apnea, so on and so forth. So those are some of the causes, some of the main causes that we tend to see for why people are not getting the sleep that they need. The really popular risk groups. So these are groups of people who tend to be at the most risk, sort of the ones that we're really concerned about, are adolescents. So teenagers in the United States are the most sleep deprived population, which is often surprising to people. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, but teenagers really don't get the sleep that they require. Caregivers, if you're responsible for caring for, some older adult or even children, they're at risk. And of course, shift work, as we mentioned, if you're working at hours that your body is typically not used to being awake and is typically used to being sleeping, then it's going to naturally decrease your total sleep time. And there are many, many effects to sleep deprivation. I'm sure if we if we were to ask, you, what do you notice when you don't get the sleep that you need, or when you feel like you haven't gotten sufficient sleep? What do you notice? The first things that people tend to tell me, and that I do notice for myself, are sort of my mood. You're a little bit more irritable, you have less patience. You may not have that drive, that energy, that motivation to do things like perhaps go for a walk or go to the gym. So definitely your overall mood is impacted, but your performance is certainly impacted too. If you're at work or engaging in any type of task, your ability to focus, concentrate, is very much decreased. If we're talking about physical performance, longer reaction time, which can be pretty dangerous. If you're driving, somebody pulls out in front of you, your time to sort of hit the brakes and react is going to be significantly decreased. Sleep deprivation increases your risk of developing a whole host of health conditions. The first few ones that are sort of red flags that we see are high blood pressure, increased risk for heart attack, stroke, and diabetes. And then we should also mention that there are some healthy ways to cope with sleep deprivation, but there are also certainly some unhelpful and hurtful things that we do. And we'll talk about which ones are helpful and which ones are hurtful a little bit more. But caffeine is definitely something that we all reach for, especially when we haven't gotten the sleep that we need. And caffeine can help us counter sleepiness. So it certainly can be a good aspect of managing sleep, but it can certainly hurt our sleep as well. There's something that we call sleep banking that can be useful. I never really encourage sleep banking or, sleep recovery unless you're in a situation where you absolutely know that you are going to go through a period of sleep deprivation. Meaning, if you know that you're working late or you have some obligation, you're not going to get the quality and quantity sleep that you need, then it is recommended that you try to recover some of that sleep. So I'll give an example. If I can't sleep tonight, the 7.5 hours that my body needs, and I'm going to get a few hours less than that for some obligation, then if I had the opportunity to take a nap today in preparation for tonight, that has shown to sort of decrease any negative performance, some negative performance skills, and sort of make up some of that missed energy and fatigue. But I'd also want to make up some of that tomorrow. So if I can take a nap tomorrow or go to bed a little bit earlier tomorrow, that's also encouraged. You can't make up all the sleep that you've missed. So oftentimes I hear people say that they will, sort of get less sleep Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday, Saturday night, they make up for that sleep, meaning that they'll sleep in much later. And it's certainly going to help you make up a little bit of sleep that you've missed, but usually after about 48 to 72 hours, you're not able to recover all the sleep that you've lost. And even within that time frame, you're only making up a small percentage. So we tend to immediately recover a little bit of that deep sleep. So that's stage 3 and REM sleep. But we don't make up all of it, and we don't make up all the other stages that we've missed. So that is important to note. Other stimulants. So that's another coping strategy that people tend to use. So we'll talk a little bit more about caffeine and napping soon. How much sleep do we need? This is a question that I think probably one of the most popular questions I get asked is, how much sleep do I need? And how do I know how much sleep is appropriate for me? And I will start by saying that, the media really pushes out 8 hours to everyone. Everyone needs 8 hours of sleep. And if you're not getting that, it's unhealthy for you. And there's going to be negative health consequences. And I'm really cautious about that because it's not necessarily true. There is variability in the amount of sleep that people need. 8 is probably the average. If we were to take everyone in the world between the ages of 26 and 64 years old, so I'm looking at this adult category here, the second to last column, the average would probably be about 8 hours of sleep, but there's certainly a range. So I would say about 66% of the population falls between 7 and 9 hours, meaning that every single night consistently, their body would require getting somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. But that means that there are still some small parts of the population that need more than 9 hours and some that need a little less than 7 hours. So this is similar, I like to describe, to shoe size. From newborn up until adulthood, your shoe size constantly changes. And then for majority of your adult life, your shoe size tends to stay the same. And you can't change what size shoe you wear day to day. You wear the same size shoe every single day. Similarly, we shouldn't be varying how much sleep we get each day, each night. We should be trying to be as consistent as possible. And I understand that in some circumstances, that's of course not optimal. It's not ideal. It's not feasible for some people. But if it is for you, that's definitely something you want to strive to do, is get consistent sleep night after night. We certainly in medicine aren't there yet where we have a blood test to know how much sleep we need. I think one day we will, but right now, the best way to sort of assess, well, how much sleep do I need, is to ask yourself, how much sleep is it that I need consistently each night to function at my best during the day? So this isn't to say tonight, see how much sleep it takes you to feel great tomorrow, because you may get 12 hours of sleep and say, Dr. Gowda, I feel fantastic today. I think my number is 12. You want to track your sleep perhaps over 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then you'll start to see, okay, this is about how many hours of sleep it takes me to really function at my best, for me to not feel excessively sleepy, for me to not doze off during, conversations or while I'm watching TV, for me to not need to, reach for extra caffeine throughout the day. Okay. The other aspect of our sleep that I think is incredibly important to note is not just how much sleep we should be getting, but when in the day or when in the night should we be sleeping. So oftentimes, especially historically, we've really pushed in society to go to bed really early and to wake up really early. That is how you're successful and productive. You shouldn't sleep in. But I like to highlight that we really do have variability here. Just as people need different amount of sleep, we need to sleep at different times. So we separate them into 3 phases. We have larks, hummingbirds, and owls. So a lot of you may have heard of night owls. If you like to stay up late or you kind of prefer that, you may refer to yourself as a night owl. Society as a whole, I would say, is built around being what we call a hummingbird. This is our neutral sleep phase. And this is the idea that you feel sleepy somewhere around the 10, 11 o'clock hour, give or take, and you feel wakeful in the morning, maybe 6, 7 a.m., somewhere around that phase. If you're advanced, what we call a lark, your bedtime is naturally, like biologically, you feel sleepy earlier in the evening. So perhaps as early as 7 or 8 p.m. is when you go to bed, but then consequently you wake up much earlier. So you're awake at 3 or 4 a.m. and you're up for the day. And owls, of course, are delayed. They feel sleepy later. I would say typically you'll see more of a midnight to 2 a.m. preferred bedtime, and then naturally a later wake time, so somewhere around 8 to 10 a.m. Even though the times I gave you are sort of the general gist of what we see, I do have patients who are morning larks who have had some testing done to really show that this is true, that their bedtime is as early as 5 p.m. in the evening. And so they're waking up at the time that a night owl is probably going to sleep. And there are night owls whose bedtime is so delayed that it is when a lark is perhaps waking up, or even later than when a lark might wake up. And what's interesting is they've done a lot of research on, why is it that we have such different phases, circadian phases, different times that we naturally prefer to sleep. And they've gone to Africa and they've used actigraphy to sort of monitor sleep amongst different tribes that have no technology, no electricity. So they're living how, all of us lived prior to electricity. And they wanted to see how much time in a day is everyone sleeping at the same time. And interestingly, what they continue to find is that among these tribes, you'll find that at the same time, 11 one-minute intervals is how often people are sleeping at the same time across 3 weeks. And so the theory here is that someone has always been awake at some point to sort of protect the rest of the tribe. So interestingly now, in 2022, most people would fall as being a hummingbird, but we have quite a few people in the population who are night owls and less so of the morning larks. There are 2 phases in our life that we have a natural change in our circadian phase. Teenagers, as I was mentioning earlier, one of the reasons that they're the most sleep deprived group is because when you hit that teenage years, typically in high school, your circadian phase naturally delays. So this idea that teenagers are up late at night, they don't go to sleep on time, there's a little bit of truth to that. Their natural biological bedtime is delayed a little bit, but then they have to be awake early for school. So they're naturally cutting a decent chunk of the sleep that their body really needs. But once they get past high school, middle of college, typically around their early 20s, that phase will naturally come back to what is normal for them. And then in older adulthood, we do tend to advance a little bit. So our bedtime will naturally sort of advance a little bit. Okay. A concept that I think is, if I had to pick one concept that I would really like to hit home, it would be the difference between sleepiness and insomnia, or sleep loss and insomnia. I'm sorry. I think people often will view these 2 things the same. When we think of insomnia, we think, it's someone who's not getting the sleep that they need, so they must be losing sleep. So bear with me as I try to describe the difference here, because they're very different concepts. Insomnia is when you have the opportunity to sleep. There is nothing getting in the way of your ability to sleep. Of your opportunity. So at night, you don't have any work to do. You're lying in bed. You want to sleep, but your body's ability to produce sleep is not there. You're wide awake. That is what we would call insomnia. Sleep loss or sleep deprivation is when you don't even have the opportunity. So if you're a new parent and a baby is crying, you're having to get up to take care of the baby. Or if you're working multiple shifts and multiple jobs, you don't even have the opportunity to lie down and get the sleep that you want to do. But your body's ability to sleep is there. If you didn't have that baby crying, if you didn't have that second job to go to, you would lie down and you would be sleeping. A lot of medical conditions will fall in the sleep loss category because your opportunity is really declining. If you have untreated sleep apnea, if you have chronic pain, those conditions are going to be sort of disrupting your sleep while you're trying to get the quality sleep that you need at night. So I think this differentiation is important because oftentimes we associate all of these conditions together as not getting the sleep that we need. And the reason it's important to differentiate is because, of course, treatment and strategies will be different whether you're experiencing insomnia or sleep deprivation, but also our health consequences are different. So insomnia is certainly a condition we want to treat. It certainly causes a lot of low mood. It's linked to depression, fatigue. It can really decrease your overall quality of life. But it's not linked to the negative health conditions that sleep loss, that sleep deprivation is linked to. So sleep loss is what is associated with a lot of those negative health consequences that we talked about earlier, such as high blood pressure, increased cardiovascular problems, diabetes, and so on. So certainly, if there are questions about the differences, we can talk more about that. Another difference that I think is really important is the difference between fatigue and sleepiness. So fatigue is what I would call, what I would say is synonymous with exhaustion, depletion, tiredness, and sleepiness would be synonymous with drowsiness. We often like to say, I'm tired, I'm going to go to sleep. And, colloquially, that's okay. But I think making sure that we differentiate, am I tired or am I sleepy? Sleepy is pretty easy to identify. Sleepy is when, you're literally going to fall asleep. Your eyes get really heavy. You might start nodding off. You can feel that your heart rate is slowing. That's sleepiness. And really, there's only one main cause, one main reason for why we're sleepy, and that is insufficient sleep. Or it's about that time that you're hitting your bedtime, so you're feeling sleepy. Sometimes, of course, sedating medications, if you're taking something for the cold or the flu, if you have, an illness, that can cause more sleepiness. But generally, day to day, if you're feeling sleepy outside of your bedtime, it's because you haven't gotten sufficient sleep. Fatigue is different though. Fatigue is that sort of low energy. You maybe come home from work or you come home from some errands and you sit down in the couch and you just feel like, I'm done for the day. I just can't do anymore. I'm just mentally exhausted. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you were to put your head on the pillow, you could fall asleep, but you're very tired. And you can certainly be sleepy and fatigued at the same time. But I think understanding this difference is important because there are hundreds of reasons why someone can feel fatigued. And so I want to take a minute to pause on this slide so that you can glance at it and maybe make a note to yourself when you look through this list of which ones are applicable to me. And I would say in a healthy adult, conservatively, people have at least 2 to 3 things that they could check off. So for you, which of these might be relevant? Because all of these are pretty common reasons for fatigue, for that tiredness, for that low energy, depleted feeling. And you can see that a lot of them are opposites of each other. So you can have too much physical activity and feel fatigued, but you can also have a very sedentary lifestyle where you don't do much and still feel fatigued. I know many people can relate to a day that they didn't really do a whole lot. They didn't exercise. They didn't get out for a walk and they still feel pretty lethargic. And that's because little activity can cause fatigue. But a lot of different medical conditions, very simple conditions like being dehydrated, just not drinking sufficient water, but also, checking your thyroid levels, heart disease, autoimmune, you name it, can cause fatigue. So taking a look at what might contribute to your fatigue, I think is incredibly important because we tend to blame sleep for a lot of our problems. We think, well, I'm feeling this way because I'm not sleeping well. And that may be part of it, But if we're not addressing these other reasons for fatigue, we could improve our sleep. We could have healthy sleep and still experience some of these fatigue, low fatigue level, high fatigue levels, low energy levels. And that can be really discouraging when you've worked on sleep, but you haven't addressed some of these other conditions. Okay, I'd like to talk now about 3 systems that are very important, very central to understanding sleep. And a lot of the recommendations that I'll make are based in these systems. So I think understanding the system is a really great skill to sort of be able to manage your sleep lifelong. So one of the systems is called our sleep drive, our homeostatic sleep drive. And this system is very similar to appetite. So the longer you go without eating, the hungrier you are. Similarly, the longer you go without sleep, the sleepier your body is. So I'm going to use myself as an example here. And you can see at the bottom, 5 a.m., I'm a fairly early riser. So I wake up at 5 o'clock and my drive for sleep is very low, just because I slept a full night of sleep. So my drive is very low. It's just like after a really big meal, I'm no longer hungry. And then as I'm busy and active throughout the day, my drive for sleep is going to build, and it's going to continue to build until approximately my bedtime. So around 10 p.m., my sleep drive is pretty high, and I'm going to fall asleep. And then as I'm sleeping, my sleep drive is going to slowly diminish until tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, it'll start over again. And that's granted that I get the sleep that I need throughout the night and wake up again tomorrow at 5 a.m. Now, there is a molecule that sort of represents sleep drive. It's adenosine. So adenosine is, a molecule that builds in our brain as we're busy and active throughout the day. And anytime we're sleeping, it's cleared. So for healthy sleep, I always tell people, we want to build as much drive for sleep as we can. How do you build sleep drive? It's truly expending energy. So number 1 would be physical activity. Getting as much physical activity as you can is going to help build this sort of line as high as possible between when you wake up in the morning until when you go to sleep. And when I say physical activity, it doesn't just mean going to the gym and getting some, exercise in. That is, of course, incredibly important for our health. But it also just means, how much energy am I expending throughout the day? Someone who might sit on their couch or at a desk at work all day and go to the gym for an hour might overall build less sleep drive than someone who's kind of walking around the house, maybe goes for 2 short walks during the day, maybe gets a little bit of exercise in, but they're just constantly moving. Perhaps they have more steps. So you want to think about overall in my day, how much energy am I really expending? How much exercise or physical activity am I getting? The other thing that really builds sleep drive for a few different mechanisms is sunlight. So in your day, how much sunlight are you really exposing yourself to? How often do you go outside? How often are you, by a window or sort of by a door that you can open? You really want to get as much sunlight exposure as you can during the day. And also social interaction is really important for building sleep drive. If you're sort of isolated, you don't interact with a lot of people, you're not going to be building as much sleep drive as perhaps, of course, I am right now as I've been talking for, the whole hour. These small lines here are 2 examples of variation. So let's say you're someone who enjoys napping and taking a nap in the middle of the day. You've built up your sleep drive, and then you've hit a point where you fall asleep to take a nap. And because you're sleeping, of course, adenosine is getting cleared. So your sleep drive is declining. And then once you wake up, it'll start building again. So naturally, at your bedtime, your drive for sleep won't be as high as it would have been had you not taken this nap. So that is why you might hear that napping is not good for your nighttime sleep, because sometimes it can since it reduces your adenosine, it can cause problems in your ability to fall asleep or stay asleep throughout the night. Now, if that's not an issue for you, if you can nap and fall asleep at bedtime and sleep through the night comfortably, then, no no need to make any changes. But if you're someone who dozes or takes a nap during the day, and then you notice at night, I don't fall asleep as quickly as I'd like, or I have several awakenings and I kind of struggle to fall back to sleep, then maybe you want to consider minimizing, shortening, or completely eliminating the nap that you take, or pushing it earlier in the day to give yourself more of the day to build back that drive. Now, this line up here would represent someone who has to stay up longer. Let's say you went to a party, a social gathering, or you went to work and you had to stay up much later than your bedtime. Your drive for sleep is going to continue to build. And so if you don't get sufficient opportunity to sleep, you may not be bringing that drive all the way back down for the next morning. The other thing I'll mention is that caffeine impacts our sleep through this system. So caffeine will temporarily block the buildup of our adenosine. So when we drink caffeine or consume it in some way, we're basically sort of putting a pause on the increase of sleepiness that we feel. But eventually that caffeine will wear off and that adenosine will still be there. It would have still been building, but we wouldn't have been feeling it. So that's how caffeine works. And I will say that caffeine is an interesting substance. It is without a doubt the biggest culprit for sleep problems in our country, no question. And one of the reasons for this is that caffeine stays in our system for such a long time. So it has a very long half-life. You know, the average half-life for someone might be closer to 5 hours. It can go up as much as 7 hours for some people. And, you know, they have identified a gene that's not very common, but some people are not impacted by caffeine. So they can have a few espressos and go to sleep and notice no impact on their sleep. But I do tell people to be very cautious about caffeine. If you notice that you're someone who struggles with sleep at night, if you feel like it's not as restful, or you have trouble falling asleep or falling back to sleep, then maybe consider, how much caffeine am I consuming? And when in the day am I consuming it? Because you might want to limit how much you're consuming and push it earlier into the day, or stop consuming caffeine at a certain point. I also think that the different sources of caffeine is something people don't realize. You know, it's not just coffee and tea, but even decaf tea, decaf coffee still has a small amount of caffeine in it, unless it says caffeine free. You know, kombucha these days has caffeine, chocolate, energy, pre-workout drinks, a lot of headache medications. So you want to be really cautious of how much caffeine your body is taking in. Okay. The circadian system, I'm going to wrap up with these next two slides, and then perhaps we can take some questions. So the second system is the circadian system. This is where we have a master clock in our brain. It's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's a tiny little speck in the sort of right stab in the middle of our hypothalamus. And essentially what happens to regulate sleep and wakefulness, we have light that goes through our retina, goes through our eye, and hits that master clock in the morning and says, it is daytime, it's time to be awake, it's time to be alert. And our master clock will send signals to the rest of the body, letting it know that it's time to stay awake and alert. In the evening, dim lighting will go through the retina, it'll hit that master clock and say the opposite. It'll say, you know, the sun is setting, bedtime is approaching, it's time to bring back these alerting cues and release melatonin. So melatonin is this natural hormone that's released a couple hours before our bedtime that sort of signals the timing of sleep. And that is how we've sort of evolved to have, you know, our daytime and our nighttime. So strategies here would really be consistency. So this circadian rhythm that we have across the 24 hours, it's happening to all of us, regardless of whether we are sort of going out and looking at the sun each day. But what helps us are things that really set the timer back in place. So it's 24 hours, but our actual internal circadian system is 24.2 hours. And we live in a world where our clocks are just 24 hours. So to really help our sort of internal clock every day reset is to get as much sunlight as you can within the first hour of waking up. If you wake up before the sun comes up, that's totally okay. You just want to go outside and get sunlight exposure in that first hour of waking up. And also in the evening, getting some sunlight exposure as the sun is setting. Sunset is also a really great sun exposure for setting these circadian rhythms. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to talking about the stress system. This last system is part of our nervous system. And I think all of us can relate to the idea that when we are stressed, when we're going through a period of, significant worry or change, our sleep is disrupted. And that is because we have two responses in our autonomic nervous system. We have what we call a fight or flight response that goes into gear when when we're in danger, when we feel that we need to protect ourselves in some way. And we have a rest and digest system, a relaxation response that promotes sleep, it promotes relaxation. It's a very calming response that we have. Our parasympathetic, our rest and digest system, is what we really want to engage for sleep. And we don't want our fight or flight response, our sympathetic nervous system, to be in high gear when we're trying to go to sleep. And that makes sense, right? If we were, let's say, at home and somebody was breaking into our house in the middle of the night, we certainly, our sympathetic nervous system is going to kick into gear, and it doesn't matter how sleepy we are, it doesn't matter what time of day it is. So those first two systems just get overridden. Our body will make sure we're awake to protect ourselves. And that's a really great thing. However, in 2022, you can imagine all of the different anxieties and worries and stressors that we have kind of engage that sympathetic response. So it's not a switch that's on or off. You want to think about it as a scale from perhaps 0 to 100. 100 is someone breaking into your house in the middle of the night, and 0 is, the most relaxed you could ever feel. So as different stressors, as things add up in your life, you sort of get pushed higher and higher on that sympathetic response scale. And you're lying down at night. There's no threat. There's nothing that's getting in the way of your safety, but your nervous system is still really, really high in that fight or flight response. And so we need to do a good job of relaxing that and engaging our relaxation response. So I'm going to stop on this slide that talks about relaxation for sleep, because these are a number of options that you could try to really throughout the day, not just before bed, but throughout the day, to sort of pump the brakes on that sympathetic response, that fight or flight response, to try to engage that parasympathetic response. And then maybe we could take some questions and I can touch on these other topics. I'm sure they may have come up.
Thank you, Dr. Gowda, for the wonderful talk. And, you made sleep much more interesting than just the 7 to 8 hours. So we've got a lot of interesting questions out here. I'll begin from the top. So we have questions on deep sleep. The questions were ways to improve the deep sleep, if there is any ways. How does aging impact deep sleep? You did mention that it reduces. So how much less is good enough is the question again on deep sleep.
Sure.
Deep and REM, which is better?
Yeah, great questions. I can probably summarize all of that to say that, the answer I have is not the answer people like to hear. And that is that, truly, when someone asks me, which one should I get more, Dr. Gowda? Should I get REM sleep or should I get deep sleep? The reality is we have no way of manipulating our sleep. If I told you, if I just were to say, it's REM sleep, you want to get REM sleep, you have no way of going tonight and getting that REM sleep, right? We don't have a way to manipulate that. And, we truly have evolved over millennia to have this natural sleep architecture, the way that we cycle. And that is what we really want. So if you get more of one stage, you're naturally getting less of another. And so perhaps you get more of the cognitive recovery, but you're not getting the physical recovery. And there are also cognitive processes happening within each. So you're going to experience deficits no matter what, in one way or another, if you lose any amount of one stage over the other. So I don't like to say that one stage is better than another, because you're going to experience deficits. What I will say is, to improve deep sleep, or to improve that feeling of sort of restorative sleep, is to really set yourself up to have quality sleep. So the way that I like to, the analogy that I like to give is, when it comes to diet, we may not fully understand how, eating spinach or eating protein is gonna, how each leaf is gonna go and digest in our system, and what it's gonna do in each organ system to make us healthy. We know that sort of eating our fruits and our vegetables and our protein, we know that balancing our diet is good for us. So similarly for sleep, setting up the right stage for getting quality sleep is the best that we can do, and our architecture will naturally follow. So making sure that you're allowing your body enough time to sleep, making sure that you're consistent, you're getting your physical activity, and if you're concerned about sleep, making sure that you're getting evaluated, if untreated sleep apnea might be in the picture for you. If you're someone who's really struggling with chronic insomnia, truly having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, getting those things addressed, that would be the best way to get the healthy architecture that you need.
Okay. So the question which followed on that was, can adenosine be measured? Is there a test?
Yeah, we've heard this a lot, and adenosine is there's some complexity to that. You can't really just go in and measure, how much adenosine do I have? But certainly the more physically active you are, the more energy that you're expending, the more adenosine you're building. And there aren't many mechanisms for that to sort of go wrong for someone. So there's no way that we know to truly measure it, not in a way that we could sort of do to help with our sleep. No, but you definitely want to build as much as you can.
Leela, can I just ask one thing? Dr. Gowda, you started your presentation with a bunch of questions for people.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure we have enough time for you to go through the answers for
Sure.
those and kind of make sure that everybody is in sync with those. But
Sure.
I just wanted to say that, and we can continue with the Q&A and then move on to that whenever
Sure.
you are ready.
Why don't I quickly answer a few of these myths that I haven't answered, Leela, and that might overlap with some of the questions.
Okay, so the next was, could you talk more about the 11 one-minute intervals observed in the study of communities without electricity?
Sure, yeah. So essentially, they were looking at how much sleep each person was getting, and I can't remember exactly how many members there were in the tribe, but it was 3 weeks. And across that time, basically, they line up all of the what we call actigraphy, where it shows us where someone is likely awake and when they're likely sleeping. And when you would line them up, you would see that there were only 11 one-minute intervals across 3 weeks where every member of the tribe was sleeping at the same time.
Right. So back on the electricity, so blue light exposure on sleep, right? And the question is, do the blue light blocking glasses help out there?
Yeah, so why don't I kind of jump ahead to that? That I was going to talk a bit about sleep technology and light, so I'll just go ahead and touch on that really quickly. So when it comes to light exposure, I want to maybe, I'll quickly summarize it by talking about the different rays of light, of course, right? I never want someone to think that blue light is bad. Blue light is absolutely good for us. It's healthy. It is what sends it's the ray of light that sends our master clock the signal that it is alerting we want to be awake. So it's not that blue light is bad. It's just excess blue light close to bedtime is not ideal, because what blue light does is it tends to suppress our release of melatonin. And we want melatonin to release in our brain to sort of remind our body, to signal to our body that bedtime is approaching, that sleep is approaching. So ideal exposure is to get a mixture of yellow blue rays in the morning, which is the sunlight. So sunrise. That's what we call low angle light exposure. So you want to look at the sunrise. It really helps sort of, like I said, sync our circadian rhythm and start the clock sort of over again each morning. Midday sunlight is where you get a lot of that blue light. It's extremely good for you in terms of, hormone secretion. It builds adenosine. It gives you more vitamin D. And then sunset is helpful because it's also low angle sun exposure, and it has yellow and blue rays as well. And what that does is it helps to mitigate some of the negative effects of that blue light that you might be exposed to when the sun goes down until you go to sleep. So that is where you truly do want to minimize blue light. Blue light blocking glasses are great. I use them in the evenings. I would say that people who tend to be night owls, they've found that their retinas are a little more sensitive to blue light than people who might be more of a hummingbird. So certainly you want to use blue light blocker glasses in the evenings, but don't use them during the day. Also, things that you can do around the home would be in the evening, turn off the overhead lights that you have and use more of the table lamps. So you want to bring the level of the light lower to the ground than above you or at your eye level. You can also, if you have dimmers in your house, that's a great thing to use. You can dim the light. You can also change your bulbs to be more yellow, orange, or red hued lights at night, as opposed to some of that bright blue light, LED light that we get from our screens.
Thank you. So the next was, what are the treatment options of consistent ptosis of the eyelid? Is that a possible indicator of insomnia?
I'll be honest, I don't know. I haven't heard that that's an indicator of insomnia. So I might want to default that question for now and maybe get back to that person on that question.
And this is on meditation. During meditation, is the brain in state similar to the one in sleep stages?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what meditation will help you do is sort of twofold. It will really help you engage that parasympathetic part of your nervous system. So it'll really promote more relaxation or more of a relaxation response and help to bring down that fight or flight, that sort of hypervigilance response that we have. But it also, it's not going to put you, unless you're falling asleep, it's not going to put you in one of the stages of sleep waves, but it will certainly reduce some of this extra, what we call like alpha waves that we may have, this extra, I don't even like to talk about it from a brainwave perspective. It's essentially reducing some of that anxiety that you're experiencing and allowing your body to have more healthy brain activity that is not too hypervigilant, but also not too low.
Menopause and sleep, the impact of menopause and sleep, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, these are all, what I'll say is, as you can tell how complex sleep is, these are all excellent questions. I just earlier this week gave a 2-hour talk on menopause and sleep. It's certainly a very important topic, and your sleep will absolutely get disrupted for a number of reasons, whether it's your body temperature, hot flashes, and there are a number of different strategies that one could use to try to combat some of the negative effects of menopause on sleep. But the reality is that your sleep will definitely take a toll when you're going through menopause because of hormone changes, and it does tend to fragment and disrupt your sleep. So I wish I could go into more depth on that topic, but if there are very specific questions, we can certainly address it. Let me quickly just go through some of these slides. Do you want to ask one more?
No, there was a question on sleep anxiety. How do you deal with it?
That is another a huge question. I would say, my first question would, for someone who was asking about sleep anxiety, might be if there's someone who does experience insomnia, which is difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, or having sort of worries about getting good sleep. Because, the number one reality about sleep anxiety is the more you're worried about sleep, the more you're thinking about sleep, the less quality sleep you're going to get. So sleep is a natural process that we all engage in, and it shouldn't have pressure built up on it. So there are a number of really effective treatments. A lot of what I treat in my practice, I would say, is managing sleep anxiety. And so the gold standard of treatment for insomnia is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. So for anyone who's really struggling with insomnia or sleep anxiety, may want to try to use CBTI as a resource to really help with anxiety, the sleep anxiety, because there are a number of avenues to try to target that, and it would be very challenging to give quick recommendations for that.
On sleep wearables, or what are the ones you would recommend? Aura, Apple Watch, Fitbit, or?
Yeah. So I would, here is my sort of spiel on consumer sleep technologies, these wearables. I would not recommend one over the other necessarily, because right now the data doesn't show us specifically that one is better. The way that you would want to, as a consumer, if you have one, I wear a lot of them just so that I get a good sense of what all my patients can see when they're wearing theirs, the Oura Ring, the Whoop, the Fitbit, the Apple Watch. Right now I have the Apple Watch on. What I will say is that if you're going to use it to try to improve your sleep, I definitely would not look at the data every single day. I would look at the data after 1 or 2 weeks to notice any trends that you see. What kind of trends am I noticing? Or use that data to show a sleep specialist, because if you're looking at the data every single day, you might get caught up in what it's showing you, which increases your anxiety about sleep. It increases the amount of time you're spending thinking about sleep, which is actually going to decrease the quality and quantity of sleep that you're getting. So the other thing to consider is that, none of them can really track stages of sleep. They claim to, and they'll show you a breakdown of deep versus REM versus light sleep. But the staging, the data is very, very poor. We're just not there yet. I think we're a few years away from being able to really assess the stages. So the data is best for people who are good sleepers, for people who don't really have trouble with sleeping. And the data is pretty poor for those who are poor sleepers. And unfortunately, people who are using these devices are not those who are great sleepers, right? They're people who are trying to improve their sleep. So that's where we get into trouble with some of these wearables. So my recommendation would be, take a look at the data after a couple of weeks, see if you notice any trends, like, how come this, every Thursday I'm getting less sleep than other days, and maybe kind of assess what's going on in my schedule that I can adjust. So I wouldn't give a recommendation for one wearable over the other.
Thank you. Would insomnia lead to dawn effect?
Would insomnia lead to what?
Lead to the dawn effect?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with what the dawn effect.
When the blood sugars dip?
Oh, the dawn of, yes, it absolutely can. It absolutely can. And that is something that you'd want to do a little bit further assessment on, to make sure, is it just insomnia that's going on, or are you also perhaps experiencing sleep loss because of, different mechanisms? So have you, such as sleep apnea, chronic pain, et cetera? Is there any sleep loss that's going on as well?
So one more question on the menopause. How does one fall back asleep after waking up with night sweats during menopause?
Yeah, night sweats is a common problem with menopause. A couple of things that, patients really find useful is trying to help cool off. So there are a lot of new blankets and mattresses and mattress pads that are cooling. One is called the chili pad, where you can sort of adjust the temperature, and you can even adjust it based on the time of night so that it can really help to cool your body as you're experiencing some of these hot flashes or night sweats throughout the night. It's one recommendation. Another is to really consider the fabric that you're wearing and the bedding that you're using, just very logistical things to minimize, sort of having to do a lot of activity in the middle of the night. And then the third thing I'll mention about being able to fall back asleep is really making sure that you're not fully alerting yourself when you wake up at night. So, you might wake up because of night sweats, hot flashes, you're already feeling pretty awake because of your hormones. So, try to avoid turning on the lights, use sort of low level lighting, like lighting. I use lights underneath the bed that are timed. So if you put your foot down, they'll turn on the least amount of light for your safety to be able to see without really alerting you. That can help you sort of fall back to sleep.
There was a question on gabapentin in inducing sleep with people with insomnia.
Yeah, let me pause on gabapentin. I'll talk about gabapentin in just a minute because I'm going to talk about a few supplements right here as I go through some of these. It seems like we still have a few minutes, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let me go through these real quick and then we'll get to gabapentin and any other questions. So melatonin is a sedative that can help treat insomnia if taken correctly. This is false. And this is because, as we mentioned, melatonin is a natural hormone that our pineal gland in our brain produces and releases every night. And I know that it's a very common over-the-counter supplement that people take, or they've been prescribed or recommended by, a physician to take, because it's not a prescription and it's relatively harmless compared to a lot of prescription medications. But the reality is that melatonin is not sedating. So, some people feel that they have a little bit of a sedative effect where they feel sleepy when they take it, but the research shows that melatonin does not help us to necessarily fall asleep faster. It doesn't treat insomnia. It's most effective when it's used to treat circadian rhythm disorders or jet lag. So taken in a very different way. So when we treat people with circadian rhythm disorders, we prescribe a very tiny dose, a micro dose, 0.3 milligrams to 0.5 milligrams. And we take it several hours before bedtime, 4 to 5 hours before bedtime. And for jet lag, sort of a low 1 to 3 milligrams right at bedtime in your destination location for a couple of nights is an effective way to use it. But our body only produces 0.2 milligrams of melatonin a day. And so when we take these 5, 10, 15 milligram doses, we're really taking way above what our body needs. More melatonin is not good. The amount that our body produces and releases is all that our body needs for that timer. So a lot of what melatonin may do is kind of a placebo effect, which we know can be very powerful. So it kind of releases some of that anxiety. People take a supplement and they feel that they've done something to address their sleep. So I never tell someone, don't take melatonin, stop taking it. If it works for you, if you feel that it improves your sleep and you enjoy taking it and you don't notice any grogginess or any side effects, by all means, keep doing it. But if you feel like, man, I have insomnia and I'm taking melatonin each night and it's not doing anything for me, that's really a sign to seek an appropriate treatment like CBTI, as opposed to resorting to melatonin or another supplement. We did talk about this already. We talked a little bit about sleep banking and how, so the answer to this, sleeping in on the weekends is good as long as my weekly average is 7 to 8 hours a night. This is false. you do want to make up some sleep that you've lost. You do want to try to nap or go to bed early before or after periods of sleep deprivation, but you definitely don't want to think it's okay to go from 10 hours a night to 6 hours a night to 9 hours just based on your schedule. This is also, you cannot train your body to get by on less sleep. I think I saw a lot of people answer this correctly. This is true. A lot of people, I can't tell you how many times I hear people, especially in the Bay Area, tell me, you know, well, Dr. Gowda, my body's gotten used to 5 hours. That's all that it needs. You know, I don't need any more than that. I've sort of trained my body. And the reality is that our body is always going to need what it truly needs. But yes, we have managed to use coping strategies to function. And when we go about our days with less than ideal quantity sleep, after a few days, our body loses the ability, we lose the ability to notice our deficits. So a few days of sleep deprivation, you'll really notice, man, I'm exhausted, I'm irritable, I'm tired. You'll notice all those symptoms. But if you consistently get less sleep over, you know, nights and nights, weeks and weeks, you lose that ability to notice those symptoms. But your deficits in performance, in your body, in your organ systems, those are going to continue to decline over time.
We've got 2 more minutes to wrap up.
Yeah, we talked about caffeine. Use it wisely. Make sure you're not using it, you know, too close to bedtime, and that you've assessed all the different sources of caffeine that you're consuming, because it does have a very long half-life. And so gabapentin, similar to other all sleep aids, they do change our natural sleep architecture. I just presented this just as an introduction, this statement, just to introduce sort of talking about supplements and prescription medication. There is always some sort of change that happens in our architecture. Some medications have a very mild effect. Some have a pretty more pronounced effect. Like, for example, Ambien can really reduce the amount of REM sleep that you get. Similar to any substance, you know, we didn't have time to talk about alcohol and nicotine and so forth, but any substance that we're taking, whether it's medication or alcohol, will naturally change our sleep architecture. So we want to be cautious of what we're taking, and making sure we're speaking with our physician as to whether the benefits of that medication for sleep are outweighing some of these negative effects.
Dr. Gowda, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You've been just an amazing presenter. Let me tell you that we've been receiving so many kudos for how you've presented the material, made it simple. But you've also covered a lot of topics that, you know, people have questions about their sleep. So demystifying has been such a great topic. I mean, the header for our talk today, and it almost seems that we will need to do another session with you to kind of get into the areas that we've not been able to cover as well. But we'll give you some rest, and then when we are back maybe next year, we can do this demystifying too.
Certainly. And I apologize that we can't get to all the detailed questions. There's, of course, so much about sleep that we can't cover in an hour. So perhaps next time.
Great. So it is up on the 7 o'clock hour. I just wanted to remind everybody that our interactive session on the seven secrets for losing weight and blood sugars and tracking or managing your blood sugars is on August 3rd at noon. And all you need to do is to send an email to sa@c@alcalino.com. Also send us your comments regarding this presentation, and we have recorded this, so you will get a link to this recording as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gowda,
Thank you.
for answering all the questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much. It has been a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good